9. The limitation of man's authority. The problem of authority is basic to the nature of any and every society. If its doctrine of authority is shattered, a society collapses, or else it is held together only by total terror. It has become commonplace on the part of scholars to avoid the fact that authority is a religious matter. The God or ultimate power of any system is also the authority and the lawgiver of that system. Iverac, in line with the humanistic evasion of the nature of authority, began his analysis by stating that the word authority, as used in ordinary language, always implies a certain amount of coerciveness. The most common meaning is that of a power to enforce obedience. This is certainly true as far as it goes, but it is false by its misdirection of emphasis. It's like defining a man as a creature who is largely hairless, has a thumb, and walks erect. Technically, this definition is correct. Practically, it has told us nothing and has evaded the central fact concerning man. Iverac recognized this limitation, and he therefore led the argument, step by step, to the conclusion that all authority is thus ultimately divine authority. This is true whether we regard the world from the theistic or from the pantheistic point of view. Since the starting point of all authority is religious, then the starting point of all discussions of authority must be religious. God is not the final link in authority, but the Alpha and Omega of all authority. All authority is, in essence, religious authority. The nature of the authority depends on the nature of the religion. If the religion is biblical, then the authority at every point is the immediate or mediated authority of the triune God. If the religion is humanistic, then the authority is everywhere, implicitly or explicitly, the autonomous consciousness of man. Men either obey authority on religious grounds, or they disobey on religious grounds. Adam and Eve were no less religious in their disobedience than in their obedience. When they assumed that man is autonomous and has a freedom of choice with respect to God's law and the freedom to determine what shall be law, they made a moral and a religious decision, and they acted in obedience to their new religious presuppositions. Disobedience to existing authority means that a new authority is in view. The disrespect of disobedience is a religious defiance of an authority. It is the denial of that authority in the name of another. When a child defies his parents saying, "I don't want to, and I won't do it," he replaces parental and religious authority with his own will. He opposes his own demand for autonomy and moral independence against the claims of God in His Word and his parents in their person. If the child obeys only through fear, it is still a religious obedience, in that power or punishment is a religious motive force in his life. The religions vary, but the fact that authority is religious remains constant. Authority is rightful power. It is dominion and jurisdiction. Men respond to acknowledged authority. They resent obeying authorities they do not recognize as such. The chief priests and elders of the people asked the right question of Jesus for the wrong reasons, being unwilling to admit what their own doctrine of authority was. But the question remains, by what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority? Matthew chapter 21, verse 23. They had already seen what his declared authority was, and had observed, Thou, being a man, makest thyself God? John chapter 10, verse 33. Jesus grounded his authority on his Father and on himself as God incarnate. Without a valid doctrine of authority, no order stands. To appeal to sentiment or gratitude is futile. Either a religious doctrine of authority binds man, or he is not bound, save at his pleasure or convenience, which is no bond at all. Let us turn again to Egyptian moral instruction for examples of this, as witness the, quote, instructions, end quote, of a father to his son. Double the food which thou givest thy mother, carry her as she carried thee. She had a heavy load in thee, but she did not leave it to me. After thou wert born, she was still burdened with thee. Her breast was in thy mouth for thee years, and though thy filth was disgusting, her heart was not disgusted. When thou takest a wife, remember how thy mother gave birth to thee, and her raising thee as well. Do not let thy wife blame thee, nor cause that she raise her hands to the god. Consider also the words of Ptolemy of the 4th dynasty. If thou art a man of standing, thou shouldest found a household, and love thy wife as home, as is fitting. Fill her belly, and clothe her back. Ointment is the prescription for a body. Make her heart glad, for she is a profitable field for her Lord. These words are beautiful and moving, and the moral sentiment is commendable, but futile. The appeal is to sentiment, not to an absolute moral law. There is here no absolute religious and moral authority undergirding the family and protecting mother and wife, nor is there a civil authority to enforce that religious law. The welfare of the mother and the wife are left to the pleasure of the individual, and so the appeal is a futile attempt to tug at the heartstrings. It is an appeal without authority. If a doctrine of authority embodies contradictions within itself, then it is eventually bound to fall apart as the diverse strains war against one another. This has been a continuing part of the various crises of Western civilization. Because the biblical doctrine of authority has been compromised by Greco-Roman humanism, the tensions of authority have been sharp and bitter. As Clarke wrote with reference to authority in the United States, it is a doctrine of both Mosaic and Christian law that governments are divinely ordained and derive their powers from God. In the Old Testament, it is asserted that power belongeth unto God, Psalm 62, verse 11, that God removeth kings and setteth up kings, Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, and that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, Daniel chapter 4, verse 32. Similarly, in the New Testament it is stated that there is no power but of God, the powers that be are ordained of God, Romans chapter 13, verse 1. In Roman law, it was originally considered that the emperor's power had been bestowed upon him by the people, But when Rome became a Christian state, his power was regarded as coming from God. In America also, God has been recognized as the source of government, though it is commonly thought that in a Republican or Democratic government, all power is inherent in the people. In early America, there was no question, whatever the form of the civil government, that all legitimate authority is derived from God. The influence of the classical tradition revived the authority of the people, which historically is equally compatible with monarchy, oligarchy, dictatorship, or democracy, but it is not compatible with the doctrine of God's authority. As a result, the authority of God has been progressively displaced in America by the authority of the new God, the people. When God is invoked, he is seen as someone who bows to the people, as a God who longs for democracy. This is no less true elsewhere. Thus, in England, Queen Elizabeth II, in her 1968 Christmas message, declared, "The essential message of Christmas is still that we all belong to the great brotherhood of man. If we truly believe that the brotherhood of man has a value for the world's future, then we should seek to support those international organizations which foster understanding between people and nations." Christ, who came to divide men in terms of himself, is seen by the Queen as one who came to unite men in terms of humanity. The Marxists, because they lack this schizophrenic and/or hypocritical position, are able to function more vigorously and systematically. The Marxist authority is rigorously humanistic and is enforced by an unabashed total terror. Under a biblical doctrine of authority, because the powers that be are ordained of God, Romans chapter 13, verse 1. All authority, whether in the home, school, state, church, or any other sphere, is subordinate authority and is under God and subject to His word. This means first that all obedience is subject to the prior obedience to God and His word, for we ought to obey God rather than men. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Compare Acts chapter 4, verse 19. Although civil obedience is specifically commanded, Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, chapter 23, verse 2 and 3, Mark chapter 12, verse 17, Luke chapter 20, verse 25, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 5, Titus chapter 3, verse 1, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7 and verse 17, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 16, etc. It is equally apparent that the prior requirement of obedience to God must prevail. Thus, the apostles had orders from their king to proclaim the gospel, and they therefore refused to be bound to silence by the legal authorities. Acts chapter 4, verse 18, chapter 5, verse 29. Compare 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 22. Second, all authority on earth, being under God and not itself God, is by nature and necessity limited authority. This limited nature of all subordinate authority is sharply set forth in a number of laws, of which an interesting one is Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 to 3. If there be a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous, and condemn the wicked. And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judges shall cause him to lie down, and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by a certain number. 40 stripes he may give him, and not exceed, lest, if he should exceed, and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee. Wright observed of the last phrase, seem vile, King James Version, is incorrect. See the Revised Standard Version. The Hebrew literally has, be made light. To give a man the punishment due him for his crime was not to dishonor him as a fellow Israelite, but to beat him indiscriminately in public was to treat him like an animal rather than with the respect due a fellow human being. This point is important, since biblical law did not permit the growth, in times of obedience, of a class of professional criminals and incorrigible delinquents. The wicked man is thus not a depraved criminal, but a sinful citizen and neighbor. He submits to the judgment and is reinstated in the community. He is not vile, or is not degraded, made light in the eyes of the community or the authorities by the punishment. In fact, at a later date, according to Waller, the punishment was inflicted in the synagogue, and the law was read meanwhile from Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 58 and 59, with one or two other passages. The reading of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 58 and 59 is important. The purpose of man's judgment was declared thereby to fulfill God's requirement and avoid God's judgment, for if thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful or extraordinary. This brings into focus a significant aspect of the intention of the law. By requiring capital punishment for incorrigible criminals, the law eliminated the enemies of godly society. It purged them from society. This is the killing side of the law. On the other hand, by requiring restitution of other significant offenders, the corporal punishment, the stripes of minor offenders, the law worked to restore man to society, to cleanse and to heal. The man who made restitution, or who received his stripes, had paid his debt to the offended person and to society, and was restored to citizenship. The reading of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 58 and 59 had in mind the avoidance of God's destroying judgment by the application of God's healing judgment. Where the law seeks to heal without killing, it kills. The surgeon must remove a hopelessly diseased organ to save the body, to heal it of its infection. But a mildly infected finger is not cut off. It is purged of infection in order to be maintained as a functioning part of the body. Whether in killing or healing, the authority of civil government is strictly governed and limited by the Word of God. The authority of the judges is thus limited authority, the maximum of 40 stripes, lest it put a distance between judge and people, lest the sinning citizen become a subject of the judge, rather than both together subjects of God the King. Punishment is always subject to the law of God. The normal sentence is restitution. In minor causes of personal controversy, it was corporal punishments, a beating. The kind of offence which was covered by corporal punishment is, among others, that of Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14. Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear thy God. I am the Lord. According to Ginsburg, the term deaf also includes the absent, and hence out of hearing. Moreover, according to the administration of the law during the Second Temple, this prohibition was directed against all cursing whatsoever. For, said they, if to curse one who cannot hear, and whom therefore it cannot grieve, is prohibited, how much more is it forbidden to curse one who hears it, and who is both enraged and grieved by it? Nor put a stumbling block before the blind. In Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 18, a curse is pronounced upon those who lead the blind astray. To help those who are thus afflicted was always regarded as a meritorious act. Hence, among the benevolent services which Job rendered to his neighbours, he says, I was eyes to the blind. Job chapter 29, verse 15. According to the interpretation which obtained in the time of Christ, this is to be understood figuratively. It forbids imposition upon the ignorant and misdirecting those who seek advice, thus causing them to fall. Similar tenderness to the weak is enjoined by the Apostle, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. Romans chapter 16, verse 13. Third, the law asserts the supremacy of the written law word of God. Man's authority is under God and limited. God's authority is unlimited. Men have no right to interpret the will of God in terms of their wants and wishes. The will of God for man is declared in his law word. The form of the civil order may vary. It may be the commonwealth governed by judges or governors, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 to 13, or a monarchy, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 to 20. But the supremacy of God's law and authority remains. The only authority in any sphere of government, home, church, state, school, or other, is the written word of God, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 9 to 11. This law word must be applied to the varying conditions of man and to the diverse social contexts. The written word is the chain that binds, nor does the varying relation between the executive and legislative authority alter the principle. The man who refused to recognize the authority of God's law word as binding on himself when the verdict was given was executed. To put away the evil from Israel, or to purge it from the land. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 12 and 13. If a king ruled, he was to be A, one of the covenant people, that is, a man of faith, because the covenant requires faith. B, he was not to multiply horses, that is, instruments of aggressive rather than defensive warfare, nor multiply wives, polygamy. And neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold, for his purpose must be the prosperity of the people under God rather than his own wealth. A rich state means a poor people. C, the king must have, read, and study the law word of God all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them. And D, the purpose of his study is not only to further God's law order, but also that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, since he is a fellow subject of God, and that he may rule in obedience to God all his days. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 to 20. Jesus Christ, as the true King, came to fulfill God's law word and to establish God's dominion, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. Psalm 40, verses 7 and 8. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 7 and 9. According to Wright, writing of Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 to 20, it is impossible to imagine such writing in another nation of the ancient Near East. Kingship was as subject to the divine law as were all the other offices of the nation. But, in biblical law, king, judge, priest, father, and people are all under the written law word of God. And the higher the position, the more important is obedience. Thus, fourth, as is already apparent, personal whims cannot take precedence over God's law, even when our property is concerned. A legitimate and godly heir cannot be set aside in favor of another son, simply because the father loves the second son. This is specified in the case of a polygamous marriage, where the firstborn may be the son of a hated wife. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 to 17. In any case, the father is not at liberty to use personal and non-religious reasons as the criterion of heirship. God's law must prevail. The only legitimate grounds of heirship are religious. We must therefore conclude that authority is not only a religious concept, but also a total one. It involves the recognition at every point of our lives of God's absolute law order. The starting point of this recognition is in the family. Honour thy father and thy mother. Out of this commandment, with its requirements that children submit to and obey the authority of their parents under God, comes a basic and fundamental training in religious authority. If the authority of the home is denied, it means that man is in revolution against the fabric and structure of life, and against life itself. Obedience, thus, carries the promise of life